But I think there is something to this constant bar that we're pushing students to that does impact students' relationship with substances and their ability to cope. And I think we focus so much on resilience that we haven't taken a step back to understand why our students are needing to be resilient. When students have to build resilience, that means there's generally some sort of trauma.
You were twisted.
So we are welcoming today Dr. de Jesus. Did I get that right?
You did.
Who is, why don't you say what you do and what your interests are rather than me mangle it?
Sure. So I am the executive director of Students Recover, which is the first online virtual platform created specifically for students, post-secondary students seeking recovery.
So this is exactly why I wanted to get you on the show. And our mutual friend Olivia put us in contact and said, you need to speak to this woman. She does some really good stuff. And I'm very interested in what's going on in higher education around recovery and that kind of stuff. Number one, because I have kids who are eventually going to get there in a few years. And my husband has worked in academia for the last 20 years or so. So we in the last few years have lived near campuses and where my husband's worked and seen a lot of this. And I remember from my own university days, a hard drinking culture was very much part of the university culture. But it was also like for someone like me who was in active alcoholism by the time I got to university how old was I? I was 22, I think. I went a bit later. The drinking and the partying was the main event. Like the studying and the getting grades was a bit further down. So, I mean, tell me how the organization started, first of all.
Sure. So I've worked in higher ed pretty much the entirety of my professional career, supporting students with substance use issues as well as students seeking recovery. And, like for many, the pandemic really changed things. And I was working at a school that was a Hispanic serving institution and also a minority serving institution. We had lots of diverse students attending our programming, but it was a relatively small community of students in recovery, or so we thought. Pandemic, everything, generally collegiate recovery is in-person services, whether it be counseling or groups or whatever. And so, again, we had a small but thriving community. The pandemic happened and everything moved virtually. And what we saw is our small community exploded. We went from 17, anywhere from 10 to 15 students to over 80 students being actively involved. And it really made me realize, we're missing an opportunity to connect with students. And it's interesting because many other institutions that offer collegiate recovery programs, we're seeing a massive decrease in students engaging in service. And one of the things I noticed was that it was those schools that were minority serving institutions that really saw the tremendous increase. And so it made me realize, my doctorate's in clinical psych and my area of expertise is health and cross-cultural psychology. So I'm always mindful and thoughtful of the different needs and different experiences of marginalized communities. But seeing that drastic change and that division in who was accessing services and how it played out made me realize we just need to do better. If you look at collegiate recovery programs, generally they're at wealthy institutions. And very few colleges in the United States even offer them, like less than 5% of colleges and universities offer them. And that doesn't include other post-secondary institutions like trade schools. There's literally not one trade school in the nation that offers recovery support services in a
Can I ask what does a collegiate recovery program look like for the schools that do have them? Could you just kind of tell us what that?
Yeah. So it's really interesting because there are some, sort of key features of support services, but it looks really different depending on campus. So generally, there's some basic things. There's some recovery support meetings. There's some staff dedicated to serving students seeking recovery. and there's some sort of community. When I say some sort of community, I'm being intentionally vague, because it really varies so much based on the institution and the culture of the institution. And you alluded a few moments ago to the hostile nature of college campuses to students who are in or seeking recovery, right? Like, it is definitely a recovery hostile space. But it's fascinating because it, A, doesn't need to be, and B, because there's so many resources that we can utilize to support these students on campus. And oftentimes they're being underutilized, not because the students won't utilize them, but because the institutions are really afraid to talk about the need for these support services. If you look at, there's some really interesting research out of University of Texas, Austin, and Sierra Castedo de Martel, who talks about how actually providing recovery support services on college campuses is a cost savings to the institution. Students in recovery end up graduating more quickly. They have a higher retention rate. They tend to be student leaders. But the stigma that's associated with collegiate recovery really stops these conversations from happening and looking at the assets that students in recovery or students seeking recovery bring to the institution. And so, the collegiate recovery community, you had asked what it looks like. It's, there are some campuses where it's really robust. Like, there's a university in Minnesota where, like, their recovery residence is like a main building on the campus. It's well talked about. It's well resourced. They have counselors and programming and funding. And then there are other institutions where it's sort of just a name only. They have a monthly meeting. And so there's a wide variety of what collegiate recovery looks like. And the Association of Recovery in Higher Education is really trying to put forth some recommendations of what the essential elements of a collegiate recovery community are, because up till now, again, there's not been any recommendations or standards for this. And the students are the ones who honestly suffer.
Yeah. And so do you feel, as somebody who's been in higher education for so long, that many, many young people are in crisis and there's even more of a need for this than there was 20 years ago?
It's so interesting. So having worked in college mental health, we know that mental health services are vastly under-resourced. And I talk about mental health in a very broad way because substance use disorder is in fact a mental health issue. Yeah. And we like to, make this arbitrary distinction, and they're not. No one develops a substance use disorder out of nowhere. People are generally trying to create some space or some distance from some sort of pain, whether it be physical pain, emotional pain, whatever. And so these services are so vastly under-resourced, and there's been so much stigma related to substance use. Or vice, on the other hand, so much downplaying of substance use, right? We look at cannabis in this country, and I'm not saying cannabis is good or bad. I'm not, this is not a judgment. But there are people who do struggle with cannabis use disorders and cannabis use issues. And we've normalized it to the point that, this is, everyone does it. And it's like, so no, not everyone uses cannabis. And not everyone who uses cannabis has a healthy relationship with their use, right? Like, but we don't create the space to have these discussions. And so it creates this space where we don't have solutions when there is a problem, in fact, occurring.
Yeah. And I don't know if you're probably aware of this, that the research is showing that Gen Z is drinking less than the generations above. But that, for me, doesn't mean that they're not catching a buzz.
Well, here's the thing, right? So I think when we talk about, and I'm going to use the word addiction, and I'm using it in quotes. Addiction isn't just alcohol use or substance use, right? Addiction is a really complex and nuanced concept. People can have a problematic relationship with pornography or with shopping or with video gaming. And we're not talking about these issues in meaningful ways when supporting youth, right? We've seen, particularly with the pandemic, people are finding creative ways of coping. And that's not a judgment, right? That's people do what they need to do to maintain their well-being and homeostasis. And if that's what keeps people alive, great. But when it becomes problematic and they realize this is no longer serving me, there's not a place for folks to go and engage in helpful supports that are accessible, that are low cost or free, and that are intentional, right? Like, if we look at things like 12 steps, great, awesome. There's lots of fellowship there. But it's very nuanced as who goes to what kind of meeting and how they're accessible. And we do a much better job of talking about issues related to substances than we do process addictions. And Students Recover, really, our goal is to create a space where all of those issues can be discussed and healed from, because these things don't happen in isolation. And while, the how it looks in practice might, how an addiction might play out in practice looks different, the etiology, the understanding of how it came to be are often very similar.
Yeah. And I've had lots of experience with process addictions, porn, gaming, gambling, just cause sex, just causes much misery. So there's a real need, and we're not there. And we do have, I think, one of the legacies for the pandemic is going to be there's a mental health crisis with young people, the isolation and all of that kind of stuff. It just, and that's going to play out in colleges where they have freedom, they have access to funds of some description, and this party culture that is so prevalent in so many schools, right?
Yeah, and it's really interesting. So the party culture, but also, when we're thinking about schools that are supporting students who come from less resources, it's not only the party culture, it's that overworking culture, right? So often, the students who I served at my previous institution, they, oh my gosh, 75% of them worked part-time or full-time. They helped fund their family's lifestyle. So not just like, right, like they help support their family of origin. And so it's not even like, oh, it's just a party, it's that hustle culture. And again, I think, if we think about it, that too plays into the addiction, right? It's that constant striving without ever being able to come to a place of, I don't want to say solitude, but like rest, where someone can actually do the work they need to do to be well.
Yeah. Well, have you read the book, How to Raise an Adult? I forget the author. It was a form. Oh, it's excellent. It's by, she's a former dean of, I think it's students, and I think she was at Stanford. And it was written about 10 years ago. And it's really, really interesting. And she said, she's been in academia for many, many years. And she says, I've noticed a real difference. Kids in the last 20 years, kids are coming to school and they are not prepared. They're not prepared for life. They can't cope. And she puts a lot of it down to how there's a generation, the bulldozer parents, where they've been like, they've been in every club and it's all about getting into the best university possible. And she said, one of the things I took away from that is the most important thing your teenager can do is have a job. That will prepare them more for university than having experiences. But one of the things she said that I found fascinating was, she said a lot of the generation she's seeing are so pushed and overworked in high school to get, to do everything, to have the best college application, to get in the best school, because that is the holy grail of middle-class parenting. She said a lot of them are reliant on Ritalin. So they're writing essays at 2, 3 in the morning, and they're using Ritalin to just get there. But then what happened? And then they're like, they got in, they got to the good school. So they get to the good school, and then they're amongst this new peer group where the bar is even higher, and they're like, oh crap. So they're continuing to use Ritalin and other amphetamines to be able to, achieve. And then they graduate, and then they're in work, and the same thing is happening. And I thought that really interesting. She said, we have a whole generation where it's almost an artificial bar because they're all on stimulants. And I just wondered if you had that experience or thoughts on that.
It's interesting. So if you look at the research, and I'm a total geek, so I look at the research, the most commonly used substances among college students is alcohol and cannabis. And in fact, rates of cannabis use is like dramatically increased since legalization has become a thing in the United States. That's not to say that students don't use Ritalin or other amphetamines or other drugs, but generally the rates are actually pretty low. So I think when you're looking at high performing scholars, yeah, you may see a higher rate of use. But amongst the general population, not as much. But I think there is something to this constant bar that we're pushing students to that does impact students' relationship with substances and their ability to cope. And I think, we, at least in higher ed, I think we focus so much on resilience that we haven't taken a step back to understand why our students are needing to be resilient. And thinking about resilience is a great thing. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but when students have to build resilience, that means there's generally some sort of trauma or impact in their life that they've had to overcome. And one of the things that Students Recover really is invested in is creating space to recognize the systemic and structural issues that inform the lived experiences of people who develop substance use and other addiction issues, and helping through peer connections navigate those experiences and normalize how to heal from them. Because I think we're so focused on the end result that we don't sit in the journey and the process. And so it's great to have the etiology of how we got there, right? Yes, students are underprepared or overprepared or whatever, but we need to be working with folks in the moment to help them really do that healing process. And I think we sometimes over focus on how people got there and not focus on how do they move beyond that space.
And so what would you like to see in that respect?
It's so interesting. I think there's so many things that we're not doing. One of the things that we need to do is we just need to start reducing the stigma and talking about the use of substances and why people use substances, and that it's okay to ask for support if you're struggling with those. And again, it's not just substances, it's also mental health issues. It's also other process addictions. Like, we just don't talk in meaningful ways about how experiences inform our life and impact our choices, right? We like to blame people for the choices they make without giving them much opportunity for healing or hope. So I think we need to do a lot more talking and reducing stigma related to one's lived experiences in relation to mental health and substance use issues. We need to create equity in supports, right? So if we look at which students have access to these kind of supports, there's a real interesting demographic profile. There's some really interesting research, and it's kind of getting old now. It's from about 2014. But if you look at the data of who accesses collegiate recovery supports, it's generally Euro-American middle upper class men at wealthier institutions. And great, we want people to access them, but we want lots of people to be able to access them, not just one particular demographic. And so, really wanting to create some equity in access to recovery supports. And this topic makes people feel really uncomfortable, but I think until we have some equity in access, we really don't understand and have the full sort of picture of what it takes to fully recover, right? Because different groups have different lived experiences. And if you have more access to resources, your ability to heal, not that it's easier, but it's more accessible and it's more likely, right? If you look at the history of the United States and how we've dealt with people who use substances, when it was communities of color that were primarily impacted, what we saw was that the war on drugs and the policies that went along with that focused on incarceration. When we saw a more upper middle class and upper middle class Eurocentric community experiencing substance use, we took a softer tone and we talked about drug courts, and we moved, we moved to concept of collegiate recovery, and treatment became normalized. And I'm grateful for all of those things, but I want to see everyone have access to those things, not just one particular demographic.
Yeah. And I agree that the truth of that can't be denied. I mean, I've worked in the addiction industry for over 20 years. And one of the things that we would see in the UK is, we have a fairly sizable Asian community, and there's massive stigma there. I mean, it's almost, if you're white, male and female, although there's more stigma to being a female, and having a substance use disorder, especially if you're a mother. It's something that, people could talk about publicly, eventually, and that kind of stuff. The Asian community, there was so much shame, and it prevented them getting treatment and getting help. And I think that's what you're saying is happening in different cultures on campus communities as well. And there's lots of different factors about that.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things that so struck me during the pandemic, I was working in college counseling, and I had a young woman who had 2 small children who had struggled intermittently with substance use issues. But during the pandemic, that mommy wine culture, she was using alcohol in tremendous amounts and realized it was problematic, knew it wasn't okay, knew she needed to do better for herself and her children. She was a single mom. And so we tried to get her into some treatment. Well, lo and behold, everything was remote. So it's not like she couldn't make it to treatment, but because her children were in the home and no one could look after them, she couldn't access resources.
Yeah.
And so, I called so many different treatment facilities and was unable to help this young woman. And so the only thing I could do was change the community in which I existed. And so we created a parenting and recovery group where, right, like, so people could come authentically as they were, right? So, because what we saw is, when we moved our services online, moms would come and they'd have their kids in the background and they'd be apologizing. And the other students were like, it's okay. Like, we're all human. Like, this is what the pandemic is showing us. Like, our lives are messy. And everyone was okay. And with the, it was moms primarily, but with the moms being there and their kids being in the background. But the moms, even with all of that, they still felt this self-consciousness. And so we created a space where it was like, it's okay if your kids are there. You don't need to keep them quiet and make sure they're perfectly well behaved. Like, they're kids, they're humans. That's not how it works. So, like, let's come together. Let's be authentic and be real and still support one another. And these are the type of things that Students Recover aims to do, right? Create these spaces that people can show up authentically, can show up in a way that they can't in other spaces, right? So thinking affinity groups where, if queer students want a queer group, great, let's make that happen. If you're not a 12-step person and you've been looking for some community that's, I don't know, I'm just being extra for a moment, but like that's related to alternative health, great, let's create that group for you. Like, let's make sure, Asian students, we know there's a lot of stigma in your communities. Great. You want a group? How do we make that? What does it look like? How do we support you? Because when we create the spaces, people show up. The thing is, we don't create the spaces. And so if it's not there, they can't show up for them.
So I'd like to know a bit more about what your organization, what it does. If there's a parent listening to this and they have a student, a child somewhere in university or going to university, and they know there's some substance use issues that they're concerned about, how can your organization help them?
Yeah, so Students Recover is a peer-based organization, right? So it's students or young professionals, those who just recently graduated, supporting other students. It's all mutual aid oriented. It's not specific to substance use. People can come with other mental health issues as well, and other addiction related issues. And students literally just go online to our webpage, register with our organization, and then can access our groups as long as they have what I will generally call an EDU address, an email address that is affiliated with some sort of higher education institution. We're literally brand new. Like, The founding of Students Recover is only possible because I have a fellowship at Princeton University. They've created the opportunity for me to build this and develop this organization. And they saw the need, right? Like there's this profound need for young people to access resources. And no one's developed it. No one's building it. No one's having these meaningful discussions about why we need these services. And so with this fellowship, I've got the time to sit down with students and ask questions and field conversations with students and with families, right? Because sometimes students aren't quite ready to jump into the conversation. But families know they at least know that their kids need some help or their loved ones need some help. And so, there's an opportunity here for communities to come together and let us know what's needed, where it's needed, right? Like we know, I was thinking about this the other day, folks on the autism spectrum, they have really specific needs. And oftentimes they don't know how to access those needs, but family members, they see that the need is there and they can reach out and be like, hey, do you have something going on? No? Okay, great. How do we support you? How do we make this happen? And so we're really trying to develop an opportunity to fill those empty spaces where people aren't getting services, where people aren't getting supports, or maybe they're getting supports, but they need extra support because, higher education has, particularly since the pandemic, really limited resources. And again, if we're looking at non-traditional higher education institutions like trade schools or small community colleges, or minority serving institutions, oftentimes they're even far less resourced than public or large private institutions. And so really trying to understand what the needs of those communities are and develop resources to make sure the students at those schools who are often ignored are getting the support that they need to be well. And also having the opportunity to build community.
One of the main purposes is we want to get the word out so all institutions know there is this resource, and what's fabulous about it is online, and we do have a student population that has some experience now of being online and all that kind of stuff. So ideally, we want every higher education institution in the country to know this is available. It's a resource, and it would go some ways to fill the hole that you've been describing.
Yeah, and it's so interesting with higher ed institutions. I feel like there's this disconnect that offices don't talk to other offices. And so it's really about creating the discussion about what the need is, but also what the resources are. And I think so often, I think you said your husband was the president of a university. They don't often, they get the reports of what happened over the weekend and, but they don't always know, like, okay, there's this national resource that, only until it becomes like a big deal do they learn about it. Right. Like, so like things like the Jed Foundation or the Steve Fund or, I'm missing another big one. But, so yeah, I really want folks to start recognizing like there are already resources that are on the ground, but we need to support those resources and make sure that they're not only being discussed, but being utilized. Because I think sometimes we build these great resources, but they're not getting to the end user. And so, I think it's really important that we start discussing them. And so one of the things that Students Recover has done, which I hadn't planned on doing until we were a bit further built out, but darn it, the students told me, and I'm listening, is that we need some organizing principles going on. And we need a way for us to have intelligent conversation nationally about the need for stigma reduction. And so we've developed these campus chapters where students on college campuses can develop these campus chapters. And I really dislike the word ally because I feel like the word ally doesn't require very much of someone. It's a more passive term.
I agree. Yeah, it's the passivity. Yeah, I agree.
It's a passive term, right? It doesn't. You can say you're an ally, and that's all you need to do.
Yeah.
But so this campus chapter is an opportunity for co-conspiration. Co-conspiration, is that a word? To co-conspire. There we
Co-inspiration.
go.
Yeah.
To co-conspire. So students who are people with lived experiences, but loved ones, students who are in the helping professions can come together and start creating a national advocacy movement and discussion about why it's important to reduce harms, to create access, to reduce stigma, because we know that stigma reduction saves lives, right? When we can actually talk about substance use, mental health, other process addictions, people are more likely to access resources and get help. And so we started our first campus chapter this September out of a school in Texas called Our Lady of the Lake University. And we're now in the process of talking to a few more institutions about developing these programs. And I think this is such an important concept because, you know, we're talking about not only creating access, but awareness. And we have far more opportunity to create change when we cultivate a culture of change versus a campus. You know, so often things happen in isolation on college campuses, and there's not a discourse happening nationally about creating change. And so Students Recover with this campus chapter movement is really about creating a national discourse about why these programs are helpful and supportive and why they need to be. Yeah, Students Recover is there for students who don't have access on their campuses or who have limited access. We want to see more collegiate recovery campus programs on campuses, but we're there to support where they don't exist. But we just need to be doing more altogether for folks who are in or seeking recovery.
Yeah, I agree. So just as we wrap up, what would you like people who are listening to this, what would you want them to take away from it if they are parents of students or involved in academia themselves? What would there be? What would their takeaways be?
I think the biggest takeaway is we need to talk more. We need to have bigger voices. We need to connect with others to create meaningful change. You know, the amount of overdoses that have happened since the pandemic has increased so dramatically. We can't continue to be quiet and expect for things to be different. And we also need to be organized and come together to create change. You know, I was at a meeting last night about the preparation for Overdose Awareness Day, and there was a discussion, well, is it just opioids? And I said, people aren't just being harmed by opioids. So why are we focusing only on opioids, right? Like, people are overdosing from many different substances, alcohol, opioids. You know, the problem isn't the particular drug. The problem is universal. And so we need to be having a universal discussion, right? Because if we're only focused on one substance, we're not changing the entirety of the experience for people. And so I think it's really important that, you know, as we're moving forward, families, I think, have a profoundly important role in what happens on college campuses, because oftentimes they're the ones who are footing the bill. And so asking questions, whether or not you have a student who's struggling with substance use or mental health issues, asking the questions of administrators, demanding that, you know, student fees, all these services are generally paid out of student fees. If it means raising the fee $2, which really, I mean, $2, what is that? But when you're talking about a campus with 10, 15, 20, 40,000 people, that's a lot of money. You know, requiring administrators to start talking about what's going on their campuses and how they're addressing these issues, because I think the stigma really stops people from having these important discussions. And so if I can leave folks with anything, it's use your voice, make demands, have requests, because if we don't, we're not going to move the needle for students.
Yeah. So how can people find you and your wonderful organization?
So they can go to studentsrecover.org. We're on Instagram and Facebook and, you know, most of those fantastic social media outlets. We're not quite on TikTok, or what is that other one that my young people love so much? I can't think of Snapchat, because I am old and don't know how to use them. I'm desperately looking for interns who
I was going to say, that's a good intern project right there.
I'm desperately looking for interns who really understand and have an interest in marketing and connecting with their peers, to really develop that piece so we can connect more with the communities of students, because Facebook is an older person's medium, I think. Although my teenager just got on Facebook, I was like,
right.
what? Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So Facebook, Instagram, all those things, and then our webpage.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. de Jesus. Did I get that?
How about just Kristine?
Kristine, Dr. Kristine, thank you so much for coming here. I love what you're doing. I really support it. I think it's much needed. It needs to be out there. Every campus needs to be aware of the support that's available, and we need to continue to build on that. Otherwise, we're going to get into trouble, because it's far cheaper to treat than it is to just avoid and ignore and, sweep it under the carpet. So thank you so much for all your work that you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody, for listening. If you want to find out more, please go to Dr. Kristine's website, and we'll put all of that in the show notes and on social media. Please reach out to me on Instagram at Veronica J. Valley. Let me know your thoughts, what you think when you see the post go up about this episode. What questions and issues do you have? Are your young people struggling with? This is a conversation we want to continue. So thanks so much for listening, everybody.